For decades, it was claimed that Adolf Hitler was a person without a private life, a socially aloof character. In fact, the dictator maintained a large number of close contacts and friendships.
Hitler must be seen as having been part of a group, not so much an entourage as a circle of friends, in which he was an equal among equals.
The support given him by this inner circle was vital to his fulfilling the role of leader.
For Hitler, a place of refuge was always important. After public appearances, he always retreated to this inner circle. He never went anywhere alone. Basically, he was always among company.
So were the dictator's political decisions influenced by his entourage, even the crimes?
In
Hitler's environment, there was never any difference between political and private life. There was no one in the court who had not been involved. There was no one in the court who had not also been a believer.
Those who belonged to the conspiratorial community around Hitler and Eva Braun were considered unconditionally loyal.
Hitler was a product of this environment. The patrons, the friends, the followers. He was by no means the Fuhrer from the beginning, who somehow created distance to these people, because he needed them.
For better or worse, the faithful linked their fate to that of the Fuhrer. In the face of war and genocide, there was no turning back on the road to ruin.
The Nazis also knew that they were murderers. They already knew that they had blood on their hands, and their thoughts now turned to the question, how do we get out of this thing in one piece?
And so the survivors claimed that Hitler alone was responsible for everything. Europe had been the scene of the First World War for 4 years. Millions had already bled to death in bitter trench warfare over a few meters of ground. But once the US entered the conflict, Germany had gone on the defensive. Then, with its last reserves of strength, it launched major offensives that failed due to its enemy's resistance. More and more Imperial soldiers had to surrender to the superior force and enter captivity. The battlefields were littered with dead. The traumatic experiences at the front marked the survivors forever. One of the soldiers was Private Adolf Hitler. Born in Austria, he volunteered for service in a Bavarian regiment in 1914. He was considered a particularly quiet, modest, and reliable subordinate. When the Supreme Army Command finally asked for an armistice in November 1918, hundreds of thousands of defeated soldiers returned home. The Kaiser had abdicated. The future was uncertain. Many believed the lie that they had remained undefeated in the field. Among them was the 29-year-old Adolf Hitler.
The First World War had a profound effect on him. It was the most formative event for the rest of his life and for the rest of his actions. Like millions of others, he was very shocked and disillusioned by the outcome of the war. And once it was over, he had little to return to. His life before the war had been a mixture of homelessness and bohemian wavering. He had no family to go home to as others did. After successfully preventing himself from being demobilized, he remained a soldier.
Hitler had lived in Munich since 1913. When he returned there, civil war was raging in the Bavarian capital. The attempt to establish a communist Soviet republic, as in Russia, was bloodily ended by right-wing Freikorps. Democratic forces had a hard time against extreme nationalists, among whom radical anti-Semitism was widespread. In this chaos, Adolf Hitler was also searching for a purpose. He was deeply convinced that Bolshevism was the greatest danger and that the Jews were entirely to blame for the world's misfortunes.
Hitler war zunächst einmal arm. Hatte wenig Geld.
Hitler was poor to begin with. He had little money. He ate in soup kitchens in Munich.
Seit 1919 arbeitete wenn man das so nennen kann.
And from 1919 he worked, if you can call it that, in the propaganda department of the Reichswehr, where he was trained as a propaganda speaker, and basically for the purpose of being sent into associations and new parties as well, simply to find out what was going on in Munich politically.
Einfach zu sehen, was politisch in München lief.
Hitler sought contact with the nationalist scene in Munich, which had declared war on the still young Weimar democracy. Even before the war, the penniless painter had often hung out in Munich pubs and cafes, it was later said, and had debated at regulars' tables with all kinds of do-gooders and political nutcases. Even then, he was not capable of close and lasting friendships. In the chaos of the post-war period, Hitler looked for a political home and wanted to found a party himself.
I think he was always rather a loner. This is also how he was described by his regimental comrades. Interestingly enough, they also said, "This man isn't suitable for leadership tasks, because as far as socializing is concerned, that's rather difficult for him." And that never changed.
But Hitler did have a talent, one that would soon make him popular. He could reach people through his speeches. This gift was discovered by Captain Karl Mayr, who was sent to fight communist efforts in the Reichswehr. Within a short time, he made Hitler a star of the nationalist scene.
He was still a soldier until 1920, and only came into contact with other circles through Karl Mayr, who was very important at the start. Hitler was used both as a trainer and also as an observer of political meetings. He then began to take an interest in the DAP, took part in its debates, and then asked for permission to join it.
Nazi Party headquarters in 1929. A propaganda film shows editor Hermann Esser at work. Karl Mayr introduced Hitler to this fanatical anti-Semite. Throughout his life, he was one of the Führer's few close friends. Max Amann had already met Hitler during the First World War. He steered the party organ Völkischer Beobachter and controlled its finances.
Hitler ist schon 1920 von einer Gruppe von Männern und Frauen umgeben.
Hitler was already surrounded by a group of men and women in 1920, as he had joined the German Workers' Party. Then, in the spring of 1920, he also joined the NSDAP, where he soon made a name for himself as a gifted speaker. He was the one who filled halls as early as 1920, but he never appeared alone. He was always accompanied by those who wished to protect him, who of course also talked among themselves. A key influence on the makeup of Hitler's later acquaintances and environment was Captain Karl Mayr, who headed the propaganda department of the Reichswehr. Through Karl Mayr, Hitler got to know Dietrich Eckart and also Ernst Röhm.
Mayr lernt Hitler, Dietrich Eckart und auch Ernst Röhm kennen.
He was certainly connected to Röhm on the soldierly side, who then also gave him access to Reichswehr circles and was therefore extremely important for him. Dietrich Eckart, on the other hand, was a completely different figure, had a certain fame as an author, but was also more of a bohemian and a morphinist, who took him under his wing a bit.
20 years his senior, Eckart waged a bitter struggle in his writings and plays against the hated and, in his eyes, un-German Weimar Republic. As editor-in-chief, he brokered the sale of the National Observer newspaper to the Nazi Party, in which he published racist and anti-Semitic polemics. Eckart had seen in Hitler the right man for the whole movement, his close associate Alfred Rosenberg later recalled in an interview for the party archives.
In dieser Tat kam ein Vertreter einer eben erst gegründeten kleinen Partei, die sich Deutsche Arbeiterpartei nannte, zu Dietrich Eckart. Und damit war die erste Verbindung zwischen der kommenden NSDAP und Dietrich Eckart hergestellt. Adolf Hitler besuchte Dietrich Eckart und dort lernte ich den Führer kennen. Seit dieser Zeit habe ich mich der NSDAP verschrieben, an dem späteren völkischen Beobachter schon am Anfang mitgearbeitet und übernahm mit Eckart dann später, nachdem er in Parteibesitz übergegangen war, die Schriftleitung dieser Zeitung.
Rosenberg saw himself as a leading theoretician of the party, supporting from the background. His relationship with the former soldiers in Hitler's circle was strained.
Rosenberg was again the exact opposite. He had not served at all because he had not been allowed to do so as a German Baltic in the Tsarist army. And he knew the evil empire from his own experience, had witnessed the Russian Revolution and was also an anti-Semite, although more of a cultural anti-Semite than a racial anti-Semite. Rosenberg impressed Hitler by the fact that he had studied architecture.
It was not only after he came to power that Hitler liked to present himself as an art lover, as here at an architecture exhibition in Munich. The dictator liked to emphasize that he would rather have been an architect than a politician, but throughout his life he remained a dilettante in this field. What he mastered was the ability to bring a whole to the boil with his nationalistic and anti-Semitic
14 Jahre sind seit dem Tage vergangen, an dem wir damals als kleine und unbekannte Bewegung zum ersten Male in diesem Saale vor die Öffentlichkeit und damit vor das deutsche Volk getreten sind. Ich weiß, dass damals viele die Aussichtslosigkeit dieser Bewegung beurteilten nach dem Maß ihrer damaligen Größe und dem Maß der Größe der Aufgaben, die gestellt waren. Sie alle hatten eines nicht erkannt, dass eine solche Bewegung natürlich Zeit braucht und Zeit haben muss, dass der neue Staat nicht eines Tages von den Wolken sie niedersenkt, sondern dass aus dem Volke selbst herauswachsen muss. Denn wenn ich Treue und Glaube und Zuversicht und Fanatismus und Hingabe bekommen will, dann muss ich dorthin gehen, wo diese Tugenden noch zu finden sind. Und sie sind zu finden im Volke selbst, in der breiten Masse dieses Volkes.
I think Hitler then very quickly discovered his rhetorical talent, which he undoubtedly had to a great extent, and there are many who testify that their attention was drawn when they first heard a speech by him. Whether Hanfstaengl or whoever, someone who went to a meeting heard him speak and said, "That's quite an interesting fellow, he somehow has thoughts that interest us," and then made contact with him. Then he meets them. But they come from very different backgrounds. Hanfstaengl actually comes from the good Munich bourgeoisie.
When Ernst Hanfstaengl met Hitler in 1922, he had just returned from the United States. The son of a publisher of art books, he had studied at Harvard and was well connected among the East Coast elite. As a loyal follower of the Fuhrer, he organized the Nazi Party's foreign contacts. In Munich, the 36-year-old, who went by the nickname Putzi, gave his new idol access to upper-class circles, to evening gatherings with classical music and dinner parties. He, like no other, represented the intellectual side of the Nazi movement, bringing Hitler out of the sweaty beer cellars and into high society, and the lure of unlimited financial resources, which the party desperately needed. In this way, Hitler was built up on various levels to become the perfect projection surface for right-wing nationalist circles.
Zunächst einmal entsteht ein früher Kreis.
First of all, an early circle developed around a capable speaker, whom they looked after and protected. But it was also a circle in which political ideas developed. And in fact, it was the case that loyalty then developed out of that. But Hitler himself, I think it's fair to say, did not initially claim to be a leader. It was practically imposed upon him. Hermann Esser, as well as Rudolf Hess, referred to this when they said, Germany needs a leader. And this leader they saw in Hitler.
In the early years, it did not seem clear for a long time who was supposed to bring the National Socialist movement to power. Hitler repeatedly asserted that he was only the drummer. In letters to his girlfriend, Ilse Pröll, Rudolf Hess wrote that he was ready to follow Hitler at a moment's notice. He trembles with rapture when he hears him speak, but fears his uncompromising haste. The letters are unique documents from the inner circle.
Briefe von Rudolf Hess aus den 1920er Jahren zeigen im Grunde den echten.
The letters of Rudolf Hess from the 1920s basically show the real Hitler. He was always on the road with him. In his letters to his girlfriend, Ilse Pröll, for all his admiration, he portrayed Hitler as someone deeply insecure, who felt uncomfortable meeting people, who never liked to travel alone, who was afraid of flying, who actually suffered from a variety of deficits. The real Hitler was a limp sausage. This myth that we still live by today, the idea that Hitler was a great leader from the very beginning, that he himself, through his outstanding abilities, virtually put himself in a position to be leader, is false. Hitler was a product. Hitler was made.
Hitler wird gemacht.
In 1934, this product was perfectly staged by director Leni Riefenstahl. Meanwhile, Rudolf Hess became the deputy of the Fuhrer, and still one of his most ardent supporters.
Die Partei ist Hitler! Hitler aber ist Deutschland, wie Deutschland Hitler ist! Hitler! Sieg! Sieg!
Bis heute ist völlig unklar.
To this day, it is completely unclear how this entourage actually came into being. Was it Hitler who sought out these people? Or was Hitler sought out by them? Loyalty was always important. That was the decisive factor for this deeply insecure and, in fact, uneducated and penniless climber. So one had the goal of establishing a Führer party. It is important, of course, that it only makes sense if this leader actually has a loyal following. If there are already problems within this following, if people quarrel and divide and actually dismantle this leader, then it makes no sense at all. So what was important was loyalty, fidelity.
In public, many of Hitler's henchmen appeared as uncouth thugs. This was quite different from the soldiers in the party. Ernst Röhm, while acknowledging Hitler's claim to political leadership, saw himself as the sole commander of the movement's military power. Hitler could not yet do without him. In Italy, the fascists had only managed to gain power in 1922 with the help of pressure from the street. Hitler understood that.
Schon die frühe Entourage besteht aus den Unterschieden.
Even the early entourage consisted of the most diverse types. On the one hand, there was Dietrich Eckart, Ernst Röhm, Alfred Rosenberg, and Rudolf Hess, but also such figures as Christian Weber and Ulrich Graf. These were, of course, completely different men than the studied Röhm, or even the merchant's son and student Rudolf Hess.
Rudolf Hess.
For personal protection, Hitler recruited supporters who were ready to use violence, such as the former soldier Christian Weber, who also took on an important function in the party.
Christian Weber ist im Grunde ein Pferdehändler, ein
Christian Weber was basically a horse trader, a Landsknechts type, who actually was part of this early personal protection. But not only that, Christian Weber was also someone who, from very early on, after Hitler became chairman of the NSDAP, helped organize propaganda events. He was someone who was permanently employed by the NSDAP, and who also, like Hess and others within the party, not only protected and accompanied Hitler, but basically also secured his rise and led him to then establish himself as a leader in that party.
Dazu führt, dass in dieser Partei sich dann als Führer etablieren kann.
At the Munich headquarters, Hitler gathered loyal henchmen around him who were to keep inner party rivals at a distance. young Heinrich Himmler was one of them. The NSDAP's radius of action was still limited to Bavaria. In the rest of the German Reich, the movement was completely unknown. To achieve the goal of a national revolution like in Italy, Hitler depended on allies. The Nazi movement was marching in Munich. The party was still an insignificant splinter group of radical opponents of democracy and anti-Semites, far from power. Even marching in lockstep was difficult for the poorly organized bunch. In order to attract attention throughout the Reich, Hitler and his followers needed a suitable person to serve as a popular figurehead. They found one in Erich Ludendorff. The general was a hero of the right-wing scene in Bavaria and considered a coming man. At the end of the First World War, he had dictatorial powers, but never took responsibility for the defeat. Ludendorff was also well connected among Bavaria's monarchists. For them, however, Hitler was only a marginal figure.
I don't think Hitler sought close private contact with the functional elites or with the top echelons of society. That was not his world. Others could do that much better, like Göring, for example. As a bearer of the Pour le Mérite and his completely different background as a fighter pilot, he was of course regarded very differently than just a simple private.
With his halo as war hero, Hermann Göring was a much better match for General Ludendorff than Hitler. And so, shortly after their first meeting, the party leader put the self-confident 30-year-old in charge of the SA, the Nazis' Sturmabteilung. In the spring of 1923, Hitler was determined to wage armed struggle, but the Bavarian government outlawed a Nazi march. Ernst Amstengel called Hitler's half-baked plans a fiasco. Within his inner circle, Hitler reiterated his threat that he would see to it that the government in Berlin was put to the lampposts. His biggest obstacle, however, was lack of funding.
The decisive factor was that patrons began to enter this circle, above all Edwin and Helene Bechstein.
This son of a Berlin piano manufacturer and his wife had been providing their chosen leader with money for some time, as well as valuable contacts.
They wanted a coming politician, a bearer of hope, who embodied their ideas of a new empire. They believed in him. After all, he was nothing. He was nothing, and he had nothing. He called himself a writer, but he'd never actually published anything. And they financed this man who, above all things, was simply good at talking, and whom they assumed could help their ideas achieve a breakthrough.
Hitler's first known film footage was shot in late September 1923 in Nuremberg, where Bavaria's far-right groups were meeting for a German day. The Nazis were also marching. The leader had only recently declared to Rudolf Hess that from his side he was determined to set fire to the powder keg. The following day, Hitler took the opportunity to pay his respects in nearby Bayreuth. The Bechstein couple had close ties to the family of the composer Richard Wagner. Wagner's son Siegfried made no secret of his right-wing nationalist and anti-Semitic views, which he shared with his wife Winifred.
Bayreuth had been receiving leading National Socialists for years. Ernst Röhm, for example, had been coming and going there. Helene Bechstein and her husband were close friends with Winifred Wagner and her husband Siegfried. The way was already prepared. And these Wagnerians actually also lived in this delusion that one day a great leader would come and build a new empire, so to speak. These were thoughts that had been virulent for a long time, that had been tried out in the salons long before Hitler ever appeared.
He came from a very simple background, and he didn't have any proper clothes. It was described how when he first appeared at the Wagners, he was wearing woolen stockings and leather pants, giving them the feeling that this was almost a person in need of help, so to speak. And how he froze there, being suddenly allowed to be where the highly revered Richard Wagner had once been. and how he looked at it all with wide open eyes.
Hitler had been a Wagner fan since his youth in Linz. After coming to power, he made the Bayreuth Festa a cultural centre of the Third Reich. Every year the dictator also paid his respects there in person. In the 1920s, Winifred Wagner in particular ensured that thanks to her international connections, financial resources flowed to the Nazi Party and its chairman.
Hitler was less a leader than a projection screen for his patrons, for supporters who themselves had very clear political ideas. And that meant they definitely wanted to get rid of this hated Weimar democracy. And to do so, they basically supported a penniless man, a man who came from the lower ranks, the so-called People's Chancellor. That was, after all, the new dream of a leader who this time would come from below, and into whom they projected their own ideas, so to speak.
Even from their first meeting in September 1923, Hitler and Winifred Wagner became particularly fond of each other. Soon they were calling each other Winnie and Wolf. Until her death, the resolute Englishwoman would hold on to their friendship, regardless of Hitler's monstrous crimes.
The fact is that he was able to have actual social relationships. He had very many social relationships, a fact that continues to be underestimated to this day. There is still the idea that he was basically an abnormal, socially disturbed being. But in fact, Hitler established a great number of relationships quite quickly. Close relationships, friendships.
In the fall of 1923, not only in the Wagner household, there was an agreement that the hated Weimar democracy must finally be abolished, by force if necessary. Large parts of the Reichswehr were also convinced of this. Again and again, there were rumors of a putsch in military and monarchist circles, but no one dared take the decisive step. At the end of October, Hitler and his followers sensed an opportunity to take the lead in the right-wing movement and sweep away the parliamentary system with a march on Berlin. On November the 9th, 1923, the 5th anniversary of the proclamation of the Republic, the Nazis initially wanted to take power in Bavaria. However, the Reichswehr and the state government refused to support them and fired on the putschists.
When Hitler failed with the putsch on November 9th to 10th, 1923, he was actually politically finished. He was finished. He was threatened with expulsion. The NSDAP was banned. The Völkischer Beobachter was no longer allowed to appear. But it was only now that a circle of patrons was formed to support this man, who was then also in prison in Lansburg. They virtually talked him into becoming the next Fuhrer.
After his arrest, Hitler initially sank into depression. When the trial of the leaders of the putschists began in January 1924, the NSDAP was banned. Hitler, Röhm, and several other Nazis were charged with high treason. In parts of the party, there was fierce criticism of the miserably failed coup. Hitler's mentor, the now deceased Dietrich Eckart, had also distanced himself. He was inwardly finished with his protégé, it was said. The co-defendant, Erich Ludendorff, also felt deceived by Hitler.
Ludendorff was a good example of the fact that this man, unfortunately, was very clever in many things, as far as politics and tactics were concerned, and used that intelligence ice-coldly. He knew that Ludendorff had a tremendous prestige because of the First World War, and it was not for nothing that his contemporaries called it the Ludendorff-Hitler Putsch, rather than the Hitler Putsch. And then later, when he was in prison, Ludendorff, of course, became dangerous to him again, through his attempted rallying movement, which Hitler rejected quite categorically, saying, "I'll do everything on my own. I'm not joining forces with anyone."
Relations with Ludendorff were strained. The general was finally acquitted. Hitler received a lenient sentence. 5 years fortress imprisonment in Landsberg. The money, books, and information. In their small shared apartment, Rudolf Hess made himself useful as a secretary, for Hitler had begun work on Mein Kampf. With the first drafts of his political manifesto in his luggage, he was released prematurely at the end of 1924. His problem was that he had only a few loyal followers left, and he was banned from speaking anywhere in Germany. A series of photos shows how meticulously Hitler prepared for his speeches. Every gesture and every emotional outburst was rehearsed even to excess, but the theatrics actually worked.
He really had people in the palm of his hand with his rhetoric. He could obviously do that. And that, of course, was extremely valuable at a time when this kind of communication played a decisive role. People didn't even have television yet. He staged these appearances very consistently at a very early stage. He held 10 or 12 meetings in Munich in one evening, in large halls all over the city. People everywhere were put in the mood for hours with speakers and all the trimmings, and then, as if from nowhere, he would suddenly appear, the man himself. And the people were completely drunk with enthusiasm. And then he was gone again.
Vielleicht wird manch unter Ihnen sein, der es mir nicht verzeihen kann, dass ich die marxistischen Parteien vernichtete. Aber mein Freund, ich habe die anderen genauso vernichtet.
Later, the Fuhrer even took acting lessons to counter his declining vocal powers. An opera singer rehearsed new techniques and old tricks with him for months. After his release from prison, Hitler initially appeared moderate. Thanks to the assurance he gave that he would not incite any more revolts, he managed to get the NSDAP and SA readmitted. The National Observer, was also allowed to appear. In Bavaria, public appearances by the party leader were permitted, but the effect was limited. Recruitment of new members was slow. What the movement lacked above all was money. Financially strong patrons were needed.
Helene Bechstein, Elsa Bruckmann had very clear political motives. To this day, these women are portrayed as mommies, elderly ladies who fell for Hitler. The opposite is the case. They financed a political candidate who was actually completely without hope in that period, up until 1930.
These patrons encouraged Hitler's slow rise with gifts of money and goods, financed cars and trips, and refurnished his shabby apartment in Munich with expensive furniture. Their political protégé was outfitted with matching clothes and went in and out of the different salons of Munich society. The publisher of racial ideological writings, Hugo Brockmann, and his wife Elsa were also ardent supporters of Hitler.
Elsa Bruckmann was a very decisive figure in the inner circle, in the early inner circle around Hitler. She later called herself his comrade in arms, and indeed she was. She made sure that he was able to rent cars. She saw to it that he could eat in hotels, and Hitler actually depended on Elsa Bruckmann for his travel needs. If his hired car broke down somewhere, she made sure that it was refueled. She made sure that he actually got to his appearances, even in the early years.
A Nazi propaganda film documented the 1927 Party Congress in Nuremberg. Membership numbers had almost returned to the level of before the attempted putsch. Hitler's fanatical and anti-Semitic speeches were finding more and more listeners. According to his supporters, the outsider Adolf Hitler was that Fuhrer who had been prophesied to the Germans. The Bechsteins and Bruckmanns were firmly convinced that they were backing the right man.
In fact, in his early years, in his years of ascent, Hitler was a dependent. He was financed. He was equipped. He himself owned nothing. He himself had no success at all, even with his book, Mein Kampf. It was more or less a shelf warmer until 1930.
In the two-volume book, Hitler recounted his career career as a purposeful mission on the road to Germany's resurgence in the fight against Bolshevism and international Jewry. At first, few Germans wanted to read the crude and mostly invented outpourings of the Fuhrer. This was soon to change.
Ist abhängig von Gönnern, die ihn finanzieren.
He was dependent on patrons who financed him for years and basically invested in a person who they didn't even know if he would ever be successful. But what's crucial is that these people, this circle of patrons, provided him with contacts and made him socially acceptable, so to speak.
Quasi gesellschaftsfähig machen.
This loyal and energetic court wanted to bring their leader to power at any cost. The capital, Berlin in particular, now entered the spotlight. Within a few years, the Nazi storm detachments were dominating the streets there, brought about by one of Hitler's most fanatical supporters, the party's Berlin Gauleiter. In 1923, Josef Goebbels was still an unsuccessful journalist and writer.
Goebbels findet dieses Konzept der Führerpartei.
Goebbels found this concept of the Fuhrer party attractive. He himself, like Hitler, dreamt of higher things. Basically, like Hitler, he felt like a failure. He had studied, but he could not succeed as a journalist. In 1923, before he met Hitler, he had been working at the Dresdner Bank, but gave up this job, basically a civil service career, because he found it too petty. Because basically, he was unable to pursue an everyday sort of career.
Einer täglichen Arbeit nachzugehen.
The narcissistically inclined Goebbels liked the Nazis' exaggerated sense of mission. After a personal encounter in 1925, the 28-year-old devoted himself body and soul to the Fuhrer. His talent for oratory and organization catapulted the lanky Rhinelander with the club foot to the leading Gauleiter position in Berlin within a very short time.
Goebbels träumt von einer neuen Weltanschauung.
Goebbels dreamt of a new world order and basically lamented the horrible existence of his generation. So, Hitler and the National Socialists appealed to him. And this exaggerated nationalism, this genius cult around Hitler, was attractive to such people. And then, basically, in his propaganda work, he put Hitler the Führer in first place.
In seiner Propagandaarbeit Hitler erst zu führen.
Hitler was the born tribune of the people, Goebbels wrote in his diary in 1926, the coming dictator with whom one could conquer the world. To achieve this, he believed, one must mystify the idea of the Führer. Only in this way could the Nazis move the masses. For years, Hitler had spent a lot of time in Berchtesgaden. During this time, his patrons even financed a house for him on Obersalzberg. There, he could let his political plans mature, receive supporters and patrons, and lead a kind of family life. At the end of the 20s, numerous photo series documenting Hitler's everyday life were taken there. They show a private man in a good mood, determined to do something.
For Hitler, a place of refuge was always important. That's one of the reasons he went to Obersalzberg. Here one could talk undisturbed, move about undisturbed. One was not observed. After public appearances, he always retreated to this inner circle. He never went anywhere alone. Basically, he was always among company. The friends, the patrons were always around him. Everything he needed, including encouragement, he received, he drew from this circle.
At his side, Rudolf Hess and the photographer Heinrich Hoffmann, who had been accompanying Hitler with his camera for years, taking countless photos for his growing following.
What Heinrich Hoffmann and also Hitler, as shrewd propagandists, realized immediately was that one could, of course, stage him wonderfully against this mountain backdrop. The mountain solitude, the lonely Messiah, the Führer who stands above all Germans, so to speak. This staging took place even before Hitler was anything at all.
Hoffmann's illustrated books, Hitler as No One Knows Him, or Hitler on His Mountains, would soon be selling like hot cakes among Germans, ensuring the Führer was always earning money. Not all of Hoffmann's photos were published, and so decades later, rare shots were found in the contact prints. In this one, Hitler's niece, Geli Raubal, is sitting next to Josef Goebbels. The fun-loving daughter of Hitler's half-sister seems to be enjoying the special attentions of her uncle.
What Hitler did not like at all, quite obviously, was when relatives interfered in his life. When he was imprisoned in Lansburg, his family visited him in the form of his niece, Geli Raubal. Since that encounter, something had obviously been developing. A short time after he was released from Lansburg, he repeatedly sought contact with his part of the family. This led so far that he actually then persuaded his niece to come to Munich in 1927-28 and to study there after graduating from high school. Between Hitler and his niece, there then developed, as we must see it today, an intimate relationship.
Angela Raubal ran her younger brother's household, and their daughter was everywhere. Geli had dropped out of medical school and started training as a singer. She dreamt of an opera career that would one day take her to the Green Hill in Bayreuth, where her uncle was revered as a savior by the Wagner community. But it soon became clear that her talent was not enough. A rare photo shows Geli at the festival alongside Helena Bechstein. In the meantime, Hitler lived with his niece in an apartment on Prinzregentplatz in Munich. Due to an affair she had with the chauffeur Emil Maurice, tensions rose again and again. Finally, on September the 18th, 1931, Geli Raubal shot herself in the chest and died. Her uncle was on an election campaign trip at the time. He transfigured the girl's death as fateful. Geli had had to sacrifice herself so that he could devote himself entirely to his task and only to the German people. A lonely messiah bereft of personal happiness. Hitler soon found a replacement for Geli in Heinrich Hoffmann's photo studio of all places. The chosen one was one of the many employees. The enterprising photographer was part of Hitler's inner circle. The fact that Eva Braun became the Fuhrer's companion guaranteed him exclusive access. Hitler had known Eva before Geli's suicide. Now she was supposed to help him forget.
Then he met Eva Braun through Hoffmann. He's 14, she's 17, which meant there was an age gap, which also implied that there was a girl who had to first subordinate herself. There were 2 suicide attempts, which were perhaps also meant to signal that he had to make a little more effort for her. And he thought, oh God, now that Geli Raubal has already killed herself, I can't afford to have another young girl do the same. He had an apartment for her. Later, she even got a house, but she was never allowed to move in with him.
Eva Braun was an enthusiastic amateur photographer, so these photographs were taken during her first visit to Obersalzberg in December 1931. It was the beginning of a long-lasting relationship. The existence of a woman at Hitler's side remained top secret. Public appearances were taboo for her. At the Berghof, on the other hand, she took on the role of mistress of the house as a matter of course.
Die Rolle Eva Brauns entwickelt sich.
Eva Braun's role developed. At first, she was an insecure Munich woman who first had to find her way into the circle. After 1933, her role became more and more important, especially after 1935, when she was installed at Obersalzberg and her function was manifold. She was the one who supported him emotionally. But she was also the one of the women who belonged to this Obersalzberg circle once said this quite clearly. Someone who could not get on with Eva Braun was not invited at all. Eva Braun, then, played a central role in the composition of the private circle around Hitler.
Zusammensetzung des privaten Zirkels Hitler.
After the Nazis seized power, the dictator was systematically sealed off. It was only by chance that Eva Braun's films survived the end of the war. They documented